So this talk is called Secrets of the Galilean Transformations. The usual thing presented in the teaching of relativity is to show there is a need to change from Newtonian physics to special relativity, and they do that by showing the Galilean transformations as presented as Newtonian physics, also called Galilean relativity, when applied to electromagnetic light equations, they don't work. And whereas the Lorentz transformation equations represented as special relativity, they show do work. But that is a false narrative. The secrets of the Galilean transformations is they're being falsely represented as Newtonian physics. So let's go into the details about that. This is what Wikipedia says, and it shows that notation where you have the primed coordinates x prime, y primed, z prime and t primed, and then you have the unprimed coordinates x, y, z and t, and it shows the relationship between those things, where you got t primed is equal to t, and that is usually taken as to mean absolute time. And Wikipedia shows the Lorentz transformations as these equations. So Einstein's first paper on special relativity is this one here from 1905, and in that paper there's no mention of Galilean transformations. So this is what Wikipedia says about Galilean transformations. In classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, i.e. Newtonian physics, and non-relativistic quantum mechanics, coordinate and velocity transformations during the transition from one inertial frame to another. The term was proposed by Philip Frank in 1909. Galileo's transformations are based on Galileo's principle of relativity, which implies the same time in all frames of reference, absolute time. And the history of Lorentz transformation is the following. The Lorentz transformations relate the space-time coordinates which specify the position x, y, z and t of an event relative to a particular inertial frame of reference, the rest system, and the coordinates of the same event relative to another coordinate system moving in the positive x direction at a constant speed v relative to the rest system. It was devised as a theoretical transformation which makes the velocity of light invariant between different inertial frames. And the relevant bit really is that early approximations of the transformation were published by Voigt 1887 and Lorentz 1895. They were completed by Lamour 1897 and 1900 and by Lorentz 1899 and 1904, and were brought into the modern form by Poincaré in 1905, who gave the transformation the name of Lorentz. Eventually, Einstein 1905 showed in the course of his development of special relativity that this transformation concerns the nature of space and time. So the bit there is that Poincaré 1905 gave the name Lorentz transformations to this maths of the Lorentz transformation. So what we have from the actual history is Einstein's first paper on special relativity was 1905. The Lorentz transformations were named in 1905 by Poincaré, and the Galilean transformations were named in 1909. So the Galilean transformations came after special relativity. From this we are getting the attempt of the false historical narrative, where the first false historical narrative is Newtonian physics with its Galilean transformations came first, and then that was followed by the special relativity with the Lorentz transformations, when really it was the other way around. The first thing was the Lorentz transformations were named, and then the Galilean transformations were named. The reason for the false narrative of first Galilean transformations and then Lorentz transformations seems to be when the Lorentz transformations were named for the theory, which became special relativity, the mainstream wanted this to be different from Newtonian physics. So there was a need to invent some transformations for Newtonian physics that would be different from Lorentz transformations, i.e. to artificially invent the difference between Newtonian physics and what Einstein was talking about in his 1905 paper. In Einstein's 1905 SR paper, special relativity paper, there is no mention of him that he is doing anything different from Newtonian physics, but the mainstream wanted it to be different, thus there was a need to revise history. It's what I call moving goalposts. And I've dealt with how the goalposts are moved in Einstein's relativity in several of my talks, such as this one we refer to here. There are lots of examples of Einstein's relativity being changed, modified or added to, and that's moving the goalposts. In this particular example we are now dealing with the secrets of Galilean transformations. The steps are: Einstein 1905 special relativity paper has no mention of being different from Newtonian physics. The next step, the mass that Einstein uses becomes called Lorentz transformations, and that prompts the issue of what would be the transformations that physics should be using before Einstein's 1905 paper. That then leads to the invention of the Galilean transformations and the false identification of that being Newtonian physics. After this revision, Newtonian physics is deemed Galilean transformations, and Einstein has a different theory with Lorentz transformations. So history gets revised. The teaching of relativity gives the false impression that the history is: first there was Galilean transformations, which was Newtonian physics, and then there was Einstein's theory of Lorentz transformations in 1905 that replaced Galilean transformations. But the actual history is: first there was Lorentz transformations, and then Galilean transformations were invented. False history is presented instead of the actual history, presumably because dumbing it down like this is deemed as makes it easier for the students to learn. Students naturally want to know why Newtonian physics gets replaced, which then prompts educators to give them a false history. The actual history, the demarcation of Einstein's 1905 paper as being different to Newtonian physics, is an artificial invention. And that would give problems if taught, raising students to ask more questions. So the false history is preferred to make it easier to shut the students up from asking more troubling questions about the origin of Einstein's relativity. Main secret is Galilean transformations are not really Galilean relativity, and by inference Galilean relativity is supposed to be Newtonian physics. So what has been presented is a false narrative to deceive people as to the relationship between Newtonian physics and special relativity. Galileo didn't mention Galilean transformations. Galilean transformations named after Galileo, but he didn't use them. The details follow. Justin Jacobs, who's looked into these things, points out Galilean transformation equations have almost nothing to do with Galileo's relativity, and that's contrary to what students are taught. He also points out in 1909 Philip Frank first referred to such equations as Galilean transformation equations. The equations were used before 1909 but were not referred to as Galilean transformations. And Justin Jacobs goes on to say, thus these equations were named in honour of Galileo, but he did not invent them. So Galilean transformation equations are not from Galileo, they're just honouring Galileo by calling them that. And he goes on to further clarification with saying such things as Galilean transformation equations were occasionally used by late 19th century mathematicians for two separate and distinct purposes. So to try to make out that Galilean transformations is all that's involved in Galileo's relativity is bogus. As per Wikipedia, it tries to present Galilean transformations as Newtonian physics. It says, in physics, the Galilean transformation is used to transform between the coordinates of two reference frames, which differ only by a constant relative motion within the constructs of Newtonian physics. So it's saying it's Newtonian physics, in other words, trying to make the link there that Galilean transformations are Newtonian physics. Britannia tries to tie them further with Newtonian physics by saying Galilean transformations are called Newtonian transformations, set of equations in classical physics that relate the space and time coordinates of two systems moving at a constant velocity relative to each other. So more blurring here, Galilean transformations, or you could also call them Newtonian transformations. So it makes it look more like it's Newtonian physics. But what actually Newton said is going to be told you to follow next slide. So this is what Newton says. Absolute, true and mathematical time of itself and from its own nature flows equally without relation to anything external, and by another name is called duration. Relative, apparent and common time is some sensible and external, whether accurate or unaccurable, measure of duration by means of motion, which is commonly used instead of true time, such as an hour, a day, a month, a year. So he's got both absolute time and relative time. So with the Galilean transformations, they seem to be dealing just with absolute time when they're saying t equals t prime. They're saying that the unprimed frame with its time t is equal to the time in the primed frame of t prime, but that's arguable. If we grant that it's dealing with the Galilean transformations are dealing with absolute time, it's not explaining how Newtonian physics is dealing with relative time. To represent Newtonian physics as solely Galilean transformations is a misrepresentation. Newtonian physics is much more complicated than just that. But obviously the teaching method must have been dumbing things down for physics students to try to make things easier for them. So Newtonian physics gets misrepresented, dumbed down when taught in relativity classes. Thus students are given a false narrative presented with what they are misled to believe is Newtonian physics. That is then pointed out as not dealing with electromagnetism and then presented with Lorentz transformations represented by special relativity and told that that works. That false narrative is presented because presumably it is deemed going into the full complexities of what Newtonian physics is would be too complicated for the poor students. So the conclusion goes, going over most of the points again, the moving goalpost is used to Einstein's relativity by the mainstream, and their use of the moving goalposts allows them to invent false narratives, such as the one given for the Galilean Transformations. Galilean Transformations is thus part of a deception played on physics students to dumb things down to them and misrepresent such things as Newtonian physics. And that is part of the secrets of the Galilean Transformations, which is hidden from physics initiatives. The mainstream just keeps sweeping certain things under the carpet so can present a false front, i.e. people in general prefer the lies because they are easy to believe than a truth that can be too complicated to understand. And that's it. Thank you.